The one verse in Hebrews 4 that rebuilt Kenyon's entire faith. Before there was a movement, before there were books, before anyone called him a father of faith teaching, there was a preacher named E.W. Kenyon sitting alone with a Bible that felt dead in his hands, and the verse that cracked it open was Hebrews chapter 4 verse 2, which reads, "For unto us was the gospel preached, which as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it." And Kenyon would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The word was preached to both groups, the same word, the same promises, the same power, sitting on the page, and yet for one group it did nothing, it did not profit them, and the difference was never the word itself. The difference was whether faith got mixed into it like leaven gets mixed into dough, and this is the moment his whole approach to Scripture changed, because he had assumed that hearing was the same as having, that reading was the same as receiving, and this one verse showed him that a Bible can sit open on your lap every single day of your life and still never become real to you if nothing in you ever mixes with it. So say it with me. I am not just hearing the Word, I am mixing faith into the Word, and it is becoming real in my life right now. That is my rebuilding verse. Again, I am not just hearing the Word, I am mixing faith into the Word, and it is becoming real in my life right now. That is my rebuilding verse. And if you want tomorrow's teaching to actually reach you instead of scrolling past you, subscribe now while this is fresh in your heart. If something in you just went quiet while you heard that, type the 2 words "I'm ready" in the comments right now. Let it be your seal on what we are about to walk through together. The first law is that hearing the Word and mixing faith with the Word are 2 completely different actions. Most people think spiritual growth is a matter of exposure. More sermons, more verses, more chapters checked off a reading plan, more Bible apps sending reminders at 7 in the morning, and Kenyon would gently correct that entire assumption. He taught that the children of Israel in the wilderness heard the exact same promises about the land flowing with milk and honey that Joshua and Caleb heard. They stood in the same crowd, under the same sky, listening to the same words spoken by the same voice, and yet it did not profit most of them because they only heard it. They let it pass through their ears and land nowhere. Nothing in them ever reached out and took hold of what was being said. Think of a woman who reads a recipe card every single night before bed. She reads the ingredients out loud. She reads the temperature. She reads the timing down to the minute. She has read that card so many times she could recite it in her sleep, and after 10 years of reading that card faithfully every night, she still cannot cook the meal, because reading a recipe and mixing the batter are not the same motion. One is passive, comfortable, requires nothing of her hands. The other requires her flour, her eggs, her heat, her willingness to actually do something physical with what her eyes only took in. This is exactly what Kenyon saw, sitting inside that one verse in Hebrews. The word preached did not profit them, not because the word was weak or the preacher was careless, but because nothing was ever mixed into it. No one brought their own believing to meet it halfway. And here is the part that stings a little. If you sit with it honestly, you can have a Bible open on your lap every single morning for years, highlighted, underlined, notes in the margins, and still be that woman with the recipe card, fluent in the words and starving at the table. So it is not that you need a new Bible, a better translation, a more gifted preacher, a longer daily reading plan. Kenyon would say, none of that was ever the missing piece. What was missing was participation. You're believing walking out to meet the Word instead of standing back and watching it from a safe distance. Think of it this way. Hearing is standing on the shore watching the water. Mixing is stepping into the water and letting it hold you. The shore is safe and dry, and it changes nothing about you. So if you have ever felt that quiet frustration of knowing Scripture inside and out, while your actual life looks untouched by any of it. You are not alone in that, and you are not broken. You simply have not yet been shown the difference between hearing a thing and mixing yourself into it. It is not more information you are missing, it is participation. I mix my faith into every word I hear. That is my first decree. The second law is that your senses are honest witnesses to the visible world and completely unreliable witnesses to the invisible one. Kenyon built an entire framework around this distinction, and he called it sense knowledge against revelation knowledge. Sense knowledge is everything you gather through your eyes, your ears, and your skin, your gut feelings. It is real, it is not evil, it is not something to despise. Your eyes are doing exactly what eyes were built to do when they report a low bank balance, or a harsh scan result, or a cold, empty room. The problem was never that the senses lie about the physical world. The problem is that people quietly promote them to judge over a world they were never built to see. Revelation knowledge is entirely different. It comes not through the eye or the ear, but through the human spirit receiving directly from the Word of God. And Kenyon taught that faith has to be anchored there, or it will collapse the instant sense. Knowledge disagrees with it, and it will disagree. Sense knowledge disagrees with the Word constantly. That is simply its nature. Picture a man who checks his bank balance on his phone every single morning before he prays. If the number is low, his prayer that day sounds like begging, dressed up in religious language. If the number is high, that same morning his prayer sounds confident and relaxed. And Kenyon would ask you to notice something uncomfortable in that picture. His faith was never actually built on the Word at all. It was built on a number. It only borrowed the vocabulary of faith, while sense knowledge quietly ran the whole operation underneath. Now widen that picture a little further. Think of a woman waiting on medical results who spends the 3 days before the appointment reading every symptom into every ache. Her hands shake. Her stomach reports disaster, hour by hour. And by sense knowledge alone, she has already died and been buried a dozen times before the phone even rings. Her eyes and her nerves are not being dishonest. They are simply reporting what eyes and nerves report under pressure. But Kenyon would say the moment she lets that reporting become the verdict, rather than the raw material, she has let a witness testify who was never qualified to rule on the case. Real faith does not consult the number first or the symptom first. Real faith consults the Word first and lets the Word interpret what the senses bring in, rather than letting the senses interpret what the Word has already said. This is not pretending the empty account does not exist. It is not pretending the ache is not there. It is refusing to let what you can measure outrank what God has already spoken. Now walk through an ordinary day and watch how many small verdicts get handed to the senses without anyone ever noticing the handoff. The alarm goes off, and the body reports tiredness, and the tiredness gets promoted straight to a verdict about the whole day ahead. The mirror reports a tired face, and the tired face gets promoted to a verdict about worth. The inbox reports 3 unpaid invoices, and the invoices get promoted to a verdict about the future itself. None of these reports are lies. The tiredness is real, the face is real, the invoices are real. But Kenyon would stop you at each one and ask whether that report was ever meant to sit on the bench as judge, or whether it was only ever meant to sit in the witness chair and wait its turn. A witness that never gets cross-examined by the Word simply runs the whole courtroom by default, and most people never even notice the trial happened before breakfast. Consider, too, how differently 2 farmers can stand in the exact same drought. The ground cracked the same way under both of them, the sky just as bare over both of their fields. One farmer lets the cracked ground testify that the harvest is already lost, and he stops watering, stops tending, stops hoping, because his eyes already delivered the verdict weeks ago. The other farmer sees the same cracked ground and lets it remain only a report, not a ruling. He keeps watering, because the promise of harvest was never actually issued by the soil in the first place. It was issued by something the soil cannot see or overturn. This is precisely the distinction Kenyon spent his life trying to get believers to feel in their bones, not two different sets of facts, the same drought, the same cracked ground, only two different courts being allowed to render the final verdict over it. And notice something else hiding in that picture. The second farmer is not a fool who denies the drought exists. He waters in full view of the cracked earth. He simply refuses to let cracked earth write the ending of the story before the season is even finished. That refusal is not denial, Kenyon would say. It is jurisdiction, knowing which court actually has the authority to close the case. Think also of a mother sitting beside a child's hospital bed who hears every monitor beep and every hushed conversation in the hallway as a fresh piece of evidence against her hope. Each beep becomes a verdict, each hushed voice becomes a sentence already passed, and by midnight she has tried the case 100 times in her own mind and lost it every single time. Kenyon would not scold her for hearing the beeps. He would only ask her gently who she has allowed to be the judge in that room. The machines were built to measure, not to rule, and the moment she lets the word cross-examine every beep instead of surrendering to it, something in her exhausted body finally exhales. And here is the part that quietly reframes something painful for a lot of people listening right now. If your faith keeps collapsing under pressure, that is not proof you are weak or spiritually behind. It is proof it was resting on the wrong foundation the whole time. A house built on sense knowledge always cracks under pressure, because pressure is exactly the weather in which senses shout loudest and revelation speaks softest. That is simply how the two knowledges behave when the storm arrives. So this week, when your feelings deliver bad news, do not waste energy arguing with the feeling or pretending it is not there. Just refuse to hand it the final vote. Let it sit in the room as information, not as verdict. Let the word cast the deciding vote every single time the two disagree, because they will disagree. That disagreement is not a sign something has gone wrong. It is simply the daily friction between two knowledges built for two different worlds. I let the word outrank what my eyes report. That is my second decree. The third law is that the reality you are praying for is very often already legally finished and simply waiting to be entered. This is where Hebrews 4 gets even richer. Because the whole chapter is not just about mixing faith, it is about a rest that God has already prepared. The chapter says, "There remains a rest for the people of God." And Kenyon read that and realized rest was not something believers were supposed to manufacture through more effort. It was something already sitting there finished, waiting for someone to stop striving long enough to walk into it. He taught that redemption itself works this way. The legal work was completed at the cross, sin was legally dealt with, righteousness was legally granted, healing and provision and standing before God were legally settled, and the believer's daily struggle is very often not to make these things true, but to discover they are already true and simply step into what has been finished. Think of a young man who is told his grandfather left him an inheritance. The money is already deposited. The account already has his name on it. The paperwork is already signed and sealed at the courthouse. And yet he spends years living like a poor man, working himself sick, terrified of debt, because he never walked into the bank to claim what was legally already his. Kenyon would say that is what most believers do with grace. They treat a finished legal reality like a future hope they must earn. When the word says the account is already settled, widen this picture a little further. Imagine that same young man discovers the inheritance letter tucked in a drawer years after it first arrived. And instead of walking to the bank, he simply reads the letter again and again, memorizing the account number, admiring the seal, telling friends about it at dinner parties, and still never once walks through the bank doors to sign the withdrawal slip, Kenyon would say that man has confused knowing about the inheritance with entering it. And this happens constantly with believers who can quote the promise about provision or peace or healing word for word and still live every day as though the account were empty. The knowing was never the missing step. The entering was. Think also of a tenant who has already been handed the keys to a house. The lease is signed, the deposit is paid, the deed work is finished. And yet she keeps sleeping in her car in the driveway out of some old habit of not believing the house is really hers. Kenyon would gently point at the keys already in her hand and ask what exactly is stopping her from turning the lock. So this week, pause for a moment and pick one real promise you have been striving to make true through worry and effort, and ask yourself honestly whether the Word already calls it finished. And if it does, your job shifts from striving to entering. That is what rest actually means here. It is not laziness, it is confidence that the paperwork is already signed. Before we go further, Kenyon spent years building what he later called the daily practice, a simple rhythm for mixing faith with the Word morning by morning, so revelation knowledge stays louder than sense knowledge. We will come back to it properly at the end of this teaching. For now, let us continue. The fourth law is that the spoken word is the tool that plants the legal fact into your actual experience. This is the deepest hinge in Kenyon's entire teaching, so let us walk through it slowly and let it settle in pieces. He taught that there is a difference between the legal and the vital. The legal is what was accomplished at the cross once for everyone, finished, unchangeable, true whether you feel it or not. The vital is how that finished reality becomes alive and active in one particular life, on one particular Tuesday, in one particular kitchen, in one particular conversation you are dreading. And the bridge between the legal and the vital, Kenyon taught, is confession. Not confession as in admitting guilt the way a courtroom uses the word, but confession in the older, richer sense. Homologia, saying the same thing God has already said, speaking in agreement with what has already been declared true, rather than inventing something new. He taught that what you keep saying about your situation eventually becomes the atmosphere your heart lives inside of. Because the ear that keeps hearing your own mouth eventually believes what it hears, far more than it believes something it merely read once in a quiet room and forgot by lunchtime. Think about a woman recovering from a long illness who is told by every doctor that she is fragile now, breakable, someone who must be careful forever, and she starts saying it herself without even noticing she has picked up the sentence. I am so fragile I cannot do what I used to do. I have to be careful. And within a year, her body and her posture and her whole bearing have shaped themselves around that sentence, not because the sentence created new cells, but because the sentence became the daily instruction her whole being kept quietly following. Every hour, every small decision about whether to reach for the high shelf or ask someone else to do it. Kenyon looked at that same mechanism and said, if repeated words can build a prison one brick at a time, repeated words can also build a doorway one plank at a time. If you keep saying what the Word says about you, instead of only what your circumstances say about you, that confession slowly becomes the architecture your life gets built inside of, brick by brick, plank by plank, without announcement. Now widen this a little further, because Kenyon noticed the same mechanism working in ordinary households where nobody would ever call what was happening spiritual at all. Think of a father who, without any cruelty intended, keeps saying of his son, "He is the clumsy one. He is the one who never finishes anything." Said at dinner, said to relatives, Said as a kind of family joke that everyone repeats so often nobody remembers who said it first. And slowly, over years, that boy's own mouth starts confessing the same sentence about himself, before anyone else even has the chance to. I always mess things up. I never finish what I start. And by the time he is a grown man reaching for something the Word of God plainly offers him, a fresh start, a finished work, a new identity, his own mouth keeps quietly overriding it with the old family confession running underneath everything. This is precisely the mechanism Kenyon was pointing at. Inside Hebrews 4, words spoken and repeated do not simply describe a life, they instruct it. They lay down tracks that the rest of the person, without ever being consulted, quietly begins to run along. This is tied directly to what Kenyon called identification, the teaching that what happened to Christ legally happened to the believer. His death counted as the old life ending. His resurrection counted as a new life beginning. And Kenyon taught that a believer who has not yet had this sink into their spirit still lives like an heir sleeping in the stable behind a house they already legally own, walking past the front door every single day without ever trying the handle. So the way that legal identification becomes vital, becomes lived, becomes real in the muscles and the mornings and the small decisions nobody else ever sees, is largely through what you keep saying about who you now are, not shouting it at the ceiling, not performing it for an audience, not turning it into a slogan on a wall, simply and steadily refusing to keep confessing the old identity over the new one. Let me walk you through what an ordinary day looks like when this actually shifts, because Kenyon was never interested in theory that could not survive a Tuesday. Imagine waking up and your very first thought is worry about a conversation you are dreading later that afternoon. In the old pattern, you would rehearse the worst version of that conversation in your mind 3 or 4 times before you even reach the coffee pot. Each rehearsal is a small confession, quiet, unnoticed, but real. Each one plants a small seed of dread a little deeper. By the time you actually walk into the room, your shoulders are already braced, your voice already thin, because your body has been primed for disaster since 6 in the morning, and nobody in that room did a single thing to cause it. You did it to yourself, with your own mouth, hours before the meeting even started. Now imagine the same morning, but instead, while the coffee is still brewing, you say quietly to yourself, I carry a righteousness that was given to me, not earned by me. I do not have to shrink in this conversation. This is not settled by how well I perform. And you say it again while you get dressed, and once more in the car, not shouted, never dramatic, just steadily return to the way you might return to check a compass. By lunch, that sentence has been repeated 4 or 5 quiet times, and something in how you walk into that room has genuinely shifted. Not because the other person changed, not because the stakes got smaller, but because what you fed your own spirit all morning changed. This is not magic, and Kenyon never once taught it as magic. He was almost allergic to anything that smelled like a formula or a trick. He taught it as law, the same way a farmer does not argue about whether seeds grow or debate the fairness of it. He simply knows that whatever seed goes into the ground eventually comes up looking like itself. Dread seeds come up as dread. Confessed rest comes up as rest. Confession is the seed, and the field is your own heart first, always first, long before it is ever anyone else's field. And here is something Kenyon was careful to add, so this teaching could never be twisted into denial. Speaking the word is not pretending the hard fact does not exist. The bill is still on the table. The diagnosis is still on the paper. The difficult son is still difficult that particular week. Confession does not erase the visible fact. It simply refuses to let the visible fact be the only voice allowed to speak into the future. You are not lying when you say what the word says. You are testifying to a deeper court than the one your eyes report to. Consider it from one more angle still. because this point is easy to hear and easy to nod at and easy to still miss. Kenyon distinguished between believing something is true in general and believing something is true for you specifically in this hour. A person can affirm with their whole theology that God is a healer, a provider, a present help, and still walk through their own Tuesday muttering only the old sense knowledge sentences, because general belief sitting quietly in the back of the mind does not confess itself into the front of the day automatically. Someone has to bring it forward on purpose, with the mouth. In the actual moment the pressure shows up. That bringing forward is the mixing. That is the muscle Hebrews 4 is pointing at. And Kenyon would remind you that this muscle, like any muscle, feels awkward and forced the very first week. Saying a settled truth out loud while your stomach still churns can feel almost dishonest at first. But he taught that the discomfort is not proof it is false. It is simply proof the old muscle has been doing all the talking for years, and the new one is still learning to move. And notice one more thing here. The old muscle got strong through repetition alone, not through being right. It simply got exercised every single day for years, while the new muscle sat idle. So of course the old one moves faster and feels more natural at first. That is not a verdict on which one is true. It is only a report on which one has been trained longer. So here is the practical shift for this week. Notice one sentence you keep repeating about yourself out of old sense knowledge habit. Maybe it is, I always mess this up. Maybe it is, nobody really sees me. Maybe it is, I will never get ahead. And replace it. Not by pretending the feeling is not there, not by pasting on a smile over real pain, but by finding what the word actually and legally declares about that exact situation and saying that instead, quietly, steadily, without performance, in the car, at the sink, before the hard email. Let your own ears start hearing the new verdict instead of the old complaint, over and over, until your own mouth becomes more familiar to your spirit than the old sentence ever was. The legal fact does not need your confession to be true. It was already true the moment it was signed. But your experience of it, your daily walking in it, waits on your mouth the way a field waits on a seed. I speak what is legally true until it becomes vitally true. That is my fourth decree. If this teaching is doing something in you right now, subscribe so tomorrow's teaching does not miss you. There is more coming, and I would rather it find you than lose you in the scroll. The fifth law is that rest is not the absence of trouble, it is the absence of struggle underneath the trouble. Kenyon was careful never to teach rest as passivity. He was not telling people to sit still and do nothing while life fell apart around them. He was pointing at something a swimmer learns the hard way. When you first fall into deep water, panic makes you thrash, arms flailing, lungs tightening, and the thrashing is precisely what pulls you under faster. But the moment you stop fighting the water and let your body go still, the water itself holds you up. Floating is not the absence of water. It is the absence of struggle against it. This is what Hebrews 4 means by entering rest. It does not mean the trial disappears. It means you stop thrashing against a thing the Word has already called finished. And notice something important here. The water in this picture never changes. It is the same deep water the whole time. What changes is only the posture of the person inside it. This is exactly how Kenyon described the rest of Hebrews 4. The circumstance often stays exactly the same shape from the outside. The bill is still due. The diagnosis is still on the paper. The phone call still has to happen. But underneath that unchanged circumstance, something in the believer has stopped fighting the water itself. Think of someone facing a frightening diagnosis who spends every waking hour Googling worst-case outcomes at 2 in the morning, scrolling through forums, tallying up statistics, replaying every symptom. That thrashing does not add 1 ounce of healing. It does not move a single test result. It only exhausts the very strength that could be spent believing. And by morning, that person is more tired than if they had actually run for miles, purely from the invisible labor of struggling against water that was never trying to drown them in the first place. Resting does not mean ignoring the treatment plan or pretending nothing is wrong. A person at rest still keeps the appointment, still follows sound counsel, still lives responsibly inside the situation. What gets laid down is the striving underneath, the frantic grasping, the sense that everything depends entirely on your own panic, holding the world together through sheer force of worry. That grasping is what Kenyon said actually gets surrendered when someone enters rest, not the situation. The struggle against the situation. Picture two people sitting in the very same waiting room, same chairs, same clock on the wall, same uncertain hour ahead of them. One sits gripping the armrest, replaying every worst outcome, checking the door every few seconds, and by the time their name is called, they are already spent, hollowed out from an hour of internal thrashing. The other sits quietly, present, aware of the same uncertainty, but not fighting it, breathing evenly, and when their name is called, they walk in steady, not because the news is guaranteed to be good, but because they did not spend the hour drowning themselves in advance. That is the whole difference this law is pointing to. It is not the absence of the storm, it is the absence of drowning inside it. I lay my striving down and let the word hold what I cannot control. That is my fifth decree. The sixth law is that there is a world of difference between praying from a position of authority and praying from a position of begging. Kenyon taught extensively on what he called the authority of the believer, and he built this teaching on a very simple courtroom picture. In a court of law, a signature only carries weight if the person signing actually has legal standing to sign. A stranger off the street cannot walk into a bank and sign a withdrawal slip on someone else's account and expect the teller to hand over a single dollar. But a son whose name is already on that account can sign the very same slip and walk out with exactly what he asked for. Not because the teller likes him better, not because he begged more sincerely, but because the signature itself carries legal weight that has nothing to do with feeling and everything to do with position. Kenyon taught that the name of Jesus functions exactly this way in prayer. It is not a magic phrase that persuades a reluctant king to finally notice you. It is closer to a legal signature that only works because of an actual standing already granted. And he said plainly that most believers pray like a stranger, hoping the teller feels generous today, rather than a son who already has full legal access to the account. Now let this become concrete, the way an ordinary day makes it undeniable. Imagine two people who both wake up facing the exact same problem, a difficult boss threatening their job. The first person spends the morning anxious. By 9 a.m. they are rehearsing apologies in their head for things they have not even done wrong yet. By noon, they corner a coworker in the break room and beg them to put in a good word, their voice cracking slightly as they explain how much they need this job. By 3, they are quietly checking job boards under their desk out of dread, refreshing listings they have no real interest in. By evening, they collapse onto the couch exhausted, having spent an entire day pleading with circumstances to be kind to them. And notice something here. That exhaustion did not come from the boss. It came from the pleading itself. The second person wakes up and quietly declares what the word says about their standing. Not shouted, not anxious, simply settled the way a person states their own name. By 9, they walk into the office, not groveling but steady. They greet the difficult boss plainly without flinching. By noon, if a hard conversation becomes necessary, they have it without apology, without the trembling voice of someone who feels they have no ground to stand on. By 3, they are still doing their actual work, focused, unhurried, instead of managing invisible panic underneath every task. By evening, they are tired from honest labor, the good kind of tired, not the hollow kind that comes from begging all day long. Kenyon would say the outward day may look almost the same from a distance. Both people faced the identical boss, the identical threat, the identical uncertain outcome, but one moved through the day as a servant hoping to be noticed kindly by a master who might or might not care, and the other moved through the day as a son who already has a settled place in the house, whether the master's mood is good or bad that particular afternoon. Notice, too, that the son in this picture is never rude, never entitled in the ugly sense. He does not demand or bully or throw his weight around. His confidence is quiet, almost unremarkable, because a person who is truly secure in a thing rarely feels the need to announce it loudly. It is only the person unsure of their standing who overcompensates with either groveling or bluster. Kenyon taught that authority exercised in prayer looks far more like calm, settled speech than it looks like shouting or striving. Think of how a homeowner speaks to a repair technician standing in their own kitchen compared to how a nervous renter might speak to a landlord they fear could evict them at any moment. The homeowner states plainly what needs fixing, asks direct questions, is not afraid to disagree, because the house is unmistakably theirs. The anxious renter hedges every sentence, apologizes for taking up time, agrees quickly just to keep the peace. And Kenyon would say, most believers pray more like that nervous renter, hedging every request, apologizing to God for asking twice, when the Word has already handed them the deed. The shift this law calls for is not learning some new technique of prayer. It is simply remembering which one you already are. In that house, I pray as a son who already belongs in the house, not a stranger begging at the door. That is my sixth decree. The seventh law is the one that finally gathers everything else into a single picture. And to see it fully, we need to walk through it slowly, in pieces, the way Kenyon himself seems to have arrived at it, not in one flash but in layers. First, consider what he called righteousness consciousness, set against sin consciousness. Most people who grew up anywhere near religion carry a quiet, constant hum of unworthiness underneath every prayer, every request. Every attempt to draw near to God, they approach the way someone approaches a judge they already assume is annoyed with them before they have said a single word, shoulders curled inward, voice small, eyes down, rehearsing an apology for existing, and this hum does not announce itself loudly. It hides inside ordinary habits, the way a person half apologizes before asking for anything, the way a person assumes the answer is no before the question is even finished. Kenyon taught that this sin consciousness, this baseline assumption that you are the problem in the room, quietly sabotages faith before faith ever gets a chance to move, because faith requires a kind of ease of approach, a boldness that does not flinch, and no one approaches boldly while secretly bracing to be turned away at the door. Righteousness consciousness is the opposite posture entirely. It is the settled, almost boring awareness that a legal right standing has already been granted, not earned through a good week of behavior, not something you top up through extra effort, simply given, the way a child does not negotiate the right to walk into their own kitchen. They already belong there. And nobody checks their credentials at the refrigerator. Notice that the child does not feel proud or superior about this. They simply do not think about it at all. That unthinking ease is exactly what righteousness consciousness feels like once it settles in. Second, consider how sense knowledge keeps trying to overturn that settled standing every single day. This is not a battle you win once and file away. It is a daily contest between what your circumstances are shouting and what the Word has already declared finished. Every morning something arrives, offering fresh evidence for sin consciousness. A mistake replayed from yesterday. A sharp word someone said that still stings. A failure that keeps looping in the quiet hours. And every morning the same small courtroom opens again inside you. Will you let that evidence testify louder than the verdict already recorded in the Word? Kenyon did not treat this as a sign of weak faith when it happened. He treated it as the normal weather of being human. The question was never whether the accusation would show up. It always shows up. The question was only which voice you would let close the case. And he noticed something important here. The accusing voice never needs new evidence. It happily recycles the same 3 old failures for years, dressing them in slightly different clothes each morning so they feel fresh. While the settled verdict of the Word never changes at all, it simply waits, patient, unbothered by the recycling, for someone to finally believe it instead. Third, consider what renewing the mind is actually doing underneath all of this. Kenyon taught that it is not a single dramatic decision, but a daily feeding, closer to how a muscle needs use, or it quietly weakens without you ever noticing the exact day it happened. Sense knowledge does not need your permission to keep broadcasting. It runs constantly, free of charge, whether you tune in or not, but revelation knowledge only grows louder if you deliberately feed it, minute by minute, morning by morning, letting the Word move past the ears and settle into the spirit until it starts to outweigh the noise. Without that feeding, sin consciousness wins by simple default, not because it is stronger, but because it never once stopped talking while the other voice went quiet from neglect. Think of 2 radio stations broadcasting in the same room at the same time. One never goes off the air. It has been running since childhood, since the first time you were scolded or compared or found lacking. The other station only plays when you personally turn the dial toward it. And if you never turn the dial, the room simply fills with whatever the first station happens to be saying that day. Fourth, and this is where Kenyon's own life becomes the clearest window into all of it. Picture him in the season before this verse struck him, a working preacher, capable, well-read, able to stand and deliver a sound sermon on any given Sunday without much trouble. He had spent years gathering doctrine the way a man might gather tools in a shed. Everything organized, everything labeled, everything technically correct. And yet he described an inward hollowness underneath all that competence, a sense that the words leaving his mouth on Sunday were true and still somehow thin, like reciting the specifications of a house he had never actually lived inside. He could describe righteousness in precise theological language and still privately flinch at his own reflection. He could preach on faith with real skill and still privately brace for disappointment when he prayed for himself. There is something almost tender in imagining that man, gifted enough to move a whole congregation with his voice, and still quietly unconvinced by his own words the moment the lights went down and the room emptied out. This is the exact gap Hebrews 4 verse 2 exposed for him. The word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith, and he realized with some discomfort that he had spent years mixing information with more information, sermon with commentary, commentary with more study, and never once mixing faith itself into what he already technically knew. Once he saw that gap, he could not unsee it, and everything downstream from that moment began quietly reorganizing itself around a single question he now asked of every verse. Not simply what does this say, but have I actually mixed anything of myself into this yet, or have I only filed it away? Fifth, let this become concrete the way an ordinary day makes it undeniable. Imagine a man who has done nothing wrong walking into a government office to renew a document he is fully entitled to renew. His paperwork is complete, his fees are paid, his name is correctly spelled on every form, and yet from the moment he sits down in the waiting room, his stomach tightens. He rehearses explanations for questions no one has asked. He assumes the clerk will find some hidden reason to send him away. He apologizes twice before he has even stated his business. Notice that nothing about his actual legal standing requires any of that bracing. His standing is settled on paper before he ever walked through the door. His anxiety is not information about his case. It is only an old habit of feeling like a trespasser even in rooms where he already belongs. This is sin consciousness exactly as Kenyon described it, a felt sense of guilt that has nothing to do with the actual legal record. Now imagine a second man walking into that same office with the same paperwork, the same fees paid, the same correct spelling, but he sits calmly. He answers questions plainly. He does not apologize for occupying a chair he has every right to occupy. If a clerk is short with him, he does not collapse into shame. He simply continues stating his case, because in his mind, the outcome was never in question. The paperwork already settled it before he ever sat down. That steadiness is not arrogance, it is righteousness consciousness. A settled knowledge of standing that has nothing to do with how deserving he feels that particular morning. Both men had identical paperwork. The only difference between their 2 days was which voice they let narrate the room. And Kenyon would say this is precisely what happens every single day in prayer. Two believers can carry the exact same finished legal standing in Christ and live two entirely different inward days, one bracing like a trespasser, one resting like an heir, and the only variable is which consciousness got fed that morning. Sixth, consider this same law from one more angle, because it is easy to nod along and still miss it. Imagine a woman who was born in a certain country and holds a valid passport proving it. Her citizenship was never in question the day she was born there. It was settled instantly, without her doing a single thing to deserve it. And yet every time she crosses a border, she feels a small flutter of dread, as though the officer might discover some hidden problem, as though her whole right to belong might be quietly revoked at the counter. She pats her pockets twice to make sure the passport is still there. She rehearses answers to questions nobody has asked her. And notice, none of that fear has anything to do with her actual citizenship. The document in her hand has already settled the entire matter. Her fear is simply an old feeling that never got updated to match the new legal fact. This is what sin consciousness does inside a believer who has already been given a completely settled standing. It keeps patting its pockets for a document that was never actually lost. And righteousness consciousness is simply what happens the day she finally stops checking her pocket every 10 minutes and starts walking through the terminal like someone who already knows the outcome. Not because she became more deserving overnight, but because she finally let the settled fact outrank the old flutter of dread. Seventh, one final piece belongs here, because Kenyon was careful to say, this consciousness is not a feeling you manufacture by trying harder to feel righteous. It is a knowledge you rehearse until it becomes as familiar as your own name. A person does not feel proud each morning remembering their own name. They simply know it. It requires no effort, no emotional performance. It has simply been repeated so many times across a lifetime that it needs no reinforcement at all. This is the destination Kenyon pointed toward, a righteousness consciousness so worn in through daily mixing that it no longer feels like an achievement. It simply feels like your own name, quietly true whether anyone in the room happens to notice or not. So here is the single picture underneath all 7 of these pieces. The word does not fail to profit a person. Because the word is weak, it fails to profit because it sits unmixed, like paperwork left in a drawer instead of carried into the room where it matters, like a passport left in a suitcase instead of carried in hand where it can actually do its work, like a legal right that is never actually exercised because the one who holds it never stopped feeling like a trespasser long enough to use it, and the moment faith gets mixed in, through a settled righteousness consciousness, through daily feeding that keeps revelation louder than accusation, through simply refusing to let old evidence close a case the Word has already ruled on. That same Word begins doing in your life exactly what it was always legally empowered to do. This was not a small adjustment for Kenyon. It was the complete rebuilding of how he approached Scripture, how he prayed, how he understood his own standing. And it can be the same rebuilding for you, not because today handed you new information, but because today you finally saw, in full, in pieces, from every angle, what mixing faith with the Word actually requires, and requires of no one but you. I mix my faith with the Word until it becomes rest instead of striving. That is my 7th decree. The 8th law is that this mixing has to become a daily rhythm, or sense knowledge, quietly reclaims the ground overnight. Kenyon was not interested in a one-time breakthrough followed by years of coasting. He taught something closer to the discipline of a farmer or a lamp keeper. The lamp does not stay lit because it was filled with oil once last year. It stays lit because someone tends it every single evening. And he would say, faith works the very same way. It is not a deposit you make once and withdraw from forever after. It is a fire that has to be fed on a schedule, or it burns down to embers while you are busy assuming it is still roaring. Think about what happens to a body if it eats one enormous meal in January and then nothing else for the rest of the year. No one would call that healthy eating. Everyone can see instantly that strength built that way collapses within weeks. And yet this is exactly how most people treat their faith. One big emotional Sunday, one powerful conference, one tearful breakthrough at an altar, and then months of silence where the Word is never mixed with anything at all. And they wonder later why the fire went out. It went out the same way any fire goes out, from lack of daily tending, not from some mysterious spiritual failure. Let me walk you through an ordinary week, the way Kenyon might have watched it unfold in someone's actual life. Picture a woman named nothing in particular, just any woman with a job and a family and a phone that buzzes before her eyes are even fully open. On Monday morning, she reaches for that phone first, checks messages, checks the weather, checks a headline, and by the time she is dressed, her mind is already full. Sense knowledge got the first meal of the day, and it got there uncontested. On Tuesday, she does the exact same thing. And by Wednesday, it is not even a decision anymore. It is simply the shape her morning has worn into, a groove the mind slides down without resistance. And Kenyon would point out that nothing dramatic happened on any of those mornings. No crisis, no failure, no sin to confess. Just 3 quiet mornings where revelation knowledge was never given a turn. And by Thursday, when real pressure finally arrives, a hard conversation at work, an unexpected bill, she notices her faith feels thin, brittle, unavailable, and she cannot understand why, because nothing happened that she can point to. But something did happen. 3 mornings of feeding the wrong voice while the other voice sat quietly starving in the corner. Now picture the same woman trying something different the following week. 5 unhurried minutes before the phone. 1 verse spoken slowly out loud instead of merely glanced at, agreed with rather than filed away. And Kenyon would say, this feels almost embarrassingly small the first few mornings. It does not feel like it is doing anything. There is no dramatic surge of confidence, no visible shift, and this is precisely where most people quit, because they expect tending a lamp to feel like lighting a bonfire. But by Thursday of that second week, when the same kind of pressure arrives, something has changed underneath, not because Thursday was easier, but because 4 mornings of feeding revelation knowledge had quietly outweighed the noise that used to run unchallenged. This is the part Kenyon kept insisting on. The fruit of daily mixing rarely shows up on the day you do it. It shows up 2 or 3 days later, in a moment you were not even thinking about your morning practice, which is exactly why so many people abandon it too soon. They judge Monday's 5 minutes by Monday's feelings instead of Thursday's steadiness. Consider it from one more angle. A garden left untended does not stay the same. It does not simply pause. Weeds do not wait politely for you to feel ready. They grow whether you are watching or not. And since knowledge behaves exactly like those weeds, it never takes a day off. It broadcasts constantly, free of charge, through every headline and every ache and every anxious glance at a bank balance. So the daily mixing was never optional maintenance for Kenyon. It was the only thing standing between a cared-for garden and a field slowly overtaken while nobody was looking. This is not a rule meant to produce guilt if a morning gets missed. He was not building another performance system with a scoreboard attached. He was simply naming how seasons work. A farmer does not moralize about planting season. He simply knows what happens to a field that gets skipped. Think, too, of how differently two households run on the exact same street. One home tends the small things daily, wipes the counter each night. He fixes the loose hinge the week it starts squeaking, and years later that house still stands solid, unremarkable, quietly cared for. The other home waits for a crisis to act, a burst pipe, a collapsed shelf, a roof finally giving way in a storm, and every repair there is louder, costlier, more dramatic than it ever needed to be. Kenyon would say a life fed daily on the Word looks a great deal like that first house. Unremarkable most days, nothing dramatic to point to, simply steady, while a life that waits for crises to reach for the Word looks like that second house, lurching from emergency to emergency, always repairing what could have been maintained. So this week, choose one small window, even 5 unhurried minutes, and instead of only reading a verse, speak it back. Agree with it out loud or under your breath. Let your own mouth hear your own faith mixing with the Word before your mind hears anything else that day. Do it again tomorrow, whether or not today felt like it worked. Because the lamp is never judged by one evening's oil. It is judged by whether someone keeps coming back with the jar. I feed my spirit before I feed my worry. That is my 8th decree. The 9th law is simply this. The rest, Hebrews 4 promises, was never meant to be rare. It was meant to be your normal address. And this is the one distinction Kenyon needed people to see more than almost any other. Because most believers treat rest the way a tourist treats a beautiful coastline. Something you visit on a good week, something you photograph and admire, and then drive away from, back to the noisy apartment where you actually live. Think of a man who goes to a retreat once a year, 3 quiet days in the mountains, good teaching, warm fellowship, and for those 3 days, something in his chest finally unclenches. He sleeps well. He prays without straining. He feels for the first time in months like the ground under him is solid. And then he drives home Sunday night, and by Tuesday morning the old tightness is back in his shoulders. The old dread is back in his stomach, and he spends the next 51 weeks quietly waiting for next year's retreat to feel that way again. Kenyon would look at that man with real compassion and say, "You have mistaken a visit for an address. You keep treating rest like a place you travel to instead of a place you already live, and that mistake alone can keep a person exhausted for an entire lifetime, chasing a feeling that was never meant to be seasonal. It was meant to be daily. It was meant to be Tuesday morning at the kitchen counter, just as much as it was the mountain retreat." This is why the 9th law is not a new technique. It is a correction of expectation. Rest is not a mountaintop you climb to on special occasions. It is the street you already live on. So consider the ordinary shape of it, the traffic that makes you late, the phone call you are dreading tonight, the bill that arrived heavier than you expected. None of these are interruptions to rest. None of them are proof rest has left you. They are simply the street. And the promise was never that the street would be empty. The promise was that you would walk it without thrashing. So this week when a hard hour comes, do not ask, "Where did my rest go?" Ask instead, what am I doing right now to leave the address I already live in? Because Kenyon discovered something quietly staggering in that verse, that the rest was already prepared before anyone entered it, which means it is not manufactured fresh by your good behavior on your best days. It is simply available, steady, unmoved, on your worst days too. Think of it one more way. A resident of a city does not feel like a foreigner every time a storm rolls through. They simply reach for an umbrella and keep walking to work. Because the storm does not revoke their residency, it is only weather passing over a street they already belong to. A visitor might panic at the first clap of thunder, uncertain whether they even have shelter nearby. But a resident already knows every alley, every awning, every shortcut home, because this has been their address for years. This is what Kenyon wanted for every believer who ever felt like a spiritual tourist in their own life. Not someone who panics at every clap of thunder wondering if they still belong, but someone who reaches calmly for what they already know is theirs and keeps walking, the same way a candle in a room does not go out just because someone opened a door and the air moved. It may flicker, it may bend, but it stays lit, because it is fed from something deeper than the draft passing through the room. That is the whole picture of what a normal address looks like. Not a life with no wind in it, but a flame that has learned the wind is not its landlord. I rest in what is already finished, and I mix my faith with it daily. That is my 9th decree. Here is the whole picture. It is not more hearing you needed, it is mixing. It is not your senses that get the final word. It is revelation. It is not effort that makes the promise true. It is a legal fact, already signed, that you simply enter. It is not silent belief that plants it into your days. It is confession that carries the legal into the vital. It is not thrashing that keeps you afloat. It is laying the striving down. It is not begging that moves heaven. It is standing in a position already given. It is not one dramatic encounter that sustains any of this. It is righteousness, consciousness, fed daily until sense knowledge stops shouting the loudest. It is not an occasional habit that keeps the lamp lit. It is a small daily mixing kept faithfully, and it is not a rare experience reserved for a preacher in crisis. It is a rest meant to be your ordinary address every single day from here forward. 9 turns, 1 key, the same key Kenyon found sitting quietly in Hebrews 4 verse 2, waiting to be mixed with faith rather than merely read. If you are ready to actually live this daily instead of just hearing it once and letting it fade by Thursday, that is exactly what the daily practice was built for, a short guided rhythm to help you mix faith with the word morning by morning until rest becomes familiar instead of rare. It is available for a small one-time cost. It comes with a full refund if it does not serve you, and you will find the link in the description below. Say it with me. I am not just hearing the word, I am mixing faith into the word, and it is becoming real in my life right now. That is my rebuilding verse. That verse did not just rebuild a preacher's faith a long time ago. It is sitting quietly in your hands right now too, waiting, patient, ready to be mixed the moment you are.